Good afternoon, everybody. I am Wade. I've been with Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission since November, so I don't have a lot of data on this project, so I'll just put in a bunch of pictures of it. Anyway, so I'm going to kind of start with just a basic biology, the life history of mink species, kind of build up to some research that's happened in the past, and then talk about the project that I'm currently working on. So Everglades mink are members of, they're carnivores, family Mustelidae. One thing that I found incredibly interesting when putting this together was that skunks are no longer considered mustelids. Up until about 2012, skunks were considered mustelids in the same group, taxonomic grouping as mink. So the mustelid group, the mustelid family does include wolverines, ferrets, otters, weasels, stoats, other species that with that same kind of body form. There are two species of mink in the world: the American mink, which ours is a subspecies of, and the European mink. And actually, European mink are endangered. American mink are not, so they're doing pretty well range across their entire range, and actually are considered an endangered invasive species in Europe. They were taken over for the fur trade, kind of got out, and are out-competing the European mink. So our subspecies that we're looking at is the Everglades subspecies, Evergladensis. Here is a map showing there are 3, potentially 4 subspecies found in Florida. So kind of the range up on the Atlantic coast, you have the Atlantic coast salt marsh mink. There's also a salt marsh species that is found on the Gulf Coast, further north from us. And then kind of the range of what we're looking at down here is the Everglades subspecies. I think it's pretty interesting. The other 2 subspecies found further north are salt marsh exclusive. They're only found in salt marsh habitat. Our subspecies is found in both salt marsh, freshwater marsh, and in cypress and flooded forest habitats. So kind of a basic life history of the Everglades mink. And this is all mink, the American mink species, not just Everglades. They are semi-aquatic, so they do readily take to water to reproduce, to basically to feed. They do feed on fish, small mammals and birds, and crayfish. Their diet is highly specialized based on where they're found, what habitat they're located in, seasonal too. They're typically solitary except during breeding season. I think the Everglades subpopulation, again, it's not very well understood, but it's believed that they breed in autumn or winter, coinciding with a late wet season, so that they can reproduce and produce their kits in a drier time of the year. And this effect, mink they do have the capability of what's called embryonic diapause or delayed implantation. So basically, once the eggs are fertilized and the zygote is formed, it's a delayed implantation into the uterine wall. So I believe that is, in other mink species, that's temperature dependent. So once the temperature ranges are within the typical whatever just they can produce their kits and the desired time of year, that kind of helps out with that. Gestation is typically 51 days. Average litter size is 4. Once born, the kits are weaned about 5 weeks of age, and they're able to hunt themselves about 8 weeks of age. They'll typically stay with the females until the fall of the year that they're born. So talking about conservation of the Everglades subspecies, it was state listed as threatened in 1973. It's continued, that's the same designation it currently has. Very little is known about the taxonomy, distribution, and population size of this subspecies. Historically, they think the range may have extended from Lake Okeechobee all the way south through the Everglades. Currently, most of the sightings are exclusive to Fakahatchee Stream Preserve State Park and Big Cypress National Preserve. So a whole long list of threats to the species. This is above and beyond just the typical predation that you would expect by alligators, hawks, owls, bobcats, panthers. And again, kind of the big theme that I've seen from today is, hydrology is a big effect on many things. And it's kind of believed that natural changes to the hydrologic regime is probably the big driving factor behind the rarity of seeing these species. Also, conversion of natural habitats to agriculture in urban areas. Anybody that's driven down US 41 through a lot of these conservation areas, you notice they're riding the road, there's a bunch of development, so potentially impacting the species, especially since they are pretty dependent on salt marsh habitat, which in itself is disappearing thanks to climate change and other factors. Other factors, there's many of them that are potentially impacting it. Canine distemper, I believe in 2012 there was a study published, and then I think within that study there were 5 mink specimens captured, or roadkills captured within Fakahatchee Strand, and I believe 4 of those were positive for canine distemper. So especially if it's a small population and could be easily affected by disease. Also, Burmese python, they think that's a big potential to impact the species, not only preying on it, but preying on their prey base, the marsh rabbit and other small rodents that the mink would potentially feed on. So just talking about some of the research that's gone on with Everglades mink, I thought this report was particularly interesting. In the late 70s, Everglades National Park conducted this research just to see what kind of population status they had on Everglades mink within the park. It was a year-long study, and I think probably the biggest results from this were that, I guess prior to the study, they didn't consider Everglades National Park part of the habitat proper for the Everglades mink, even given that it was called Everglades mink. So during the study, prior to the study between 1974 and 1977, there were 10 casual sightings within the park. Just an observer saw them, reported it to the park ranger or the biologist. During the study, there were 9 sightings, and then from 1946 to 1979, 21 specimens were collected. Some of the lessons learned from the study that went on, again, indicated a further extent of the range that they previously believed. Kind of opposite what we found from a lot of reports coming from Fakahatchee, is that most of the sightings in Everglades National Park were from the wet season. Most of the sightings in Fakahatchee are from the dry season. And within this study, and I believe also there are 2 different studies, the canine distemper study and a parasite study, most of the specimens that were collected, roadkill and otherwise, were male. So we're probably speaking to kind of like a male panther has a large home range that they defend, similar things with male Everglades mink. And again, one of the suggestions from the study was maintenance of natural seasonal water levels within the Everglades and the ecosystem in which they're found. So this graph was courtesy of Mike Owen from Fakahatchee Strand State Park. He sent me a record of mink sightings from 1994 through 2014. It's pretty interesting. You can see some peaks and some drops, and this is sightings that are both from himself and his crew and from volunteers. And he did tell me that starting in 2008 there was and since then there's been a general increase in the number of volunteers. So this isn't corrected for effort in going towards sightings, but still kind of interesting to see there were peaks in between 2000 and 2005, and then I think actually it was 2004 is when they found that they did the distemper study. So potentially that drop could be potentially associated with that. Also, another interesting study comes from the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. There was an injured, hit by a car mink captured and taken to the rehab center from Fakahatchee Strand. Prior to rehabbing and successfully releasing the mink, they were able to actually put a transmitter in it so they could go out there and monitor its location and movement over the course of from March to October. I think they would have continued with their monitoring, but the mink disappeared. Either the transmitter failed or something happened to the mink. So data from that, I think, is still probably forthcoming, but they did get, I don't remember how many data points of basically habitat locations for this individual. And then another interesting study coming from Everglades National Park in 2014, they found mink remains in the stomach of an American alligator. So kind of just going to show that the Everglades National Park is still home to Everglades mink, although no physical sightings have occurred, at least to my knowledge, within the park since, I believe, 2011. And again, this study kind of did say human-induced changes to hydrology were probably a big impact on mink, as well as this being compacted by predators such as coyotes and Burmese pythons increasing in the study areas. So this kind of gets me to the project that I'm working on. It's not just the project isn't just surveying Everglades mink, it's a statewide survey that's also working on that Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast populations. So we all have very similar study objectives, basically to determine the distribution of the mink, these different subpopulations, kind of get an idea of, if possible, to get habitat selection and critical habitat identified for all the subspecies, and then also investigate the taxonomic differences between the three species. The protocol has actually changed a little bit since I came on in November, so the protocol they were using is different than mine. It's pretty similar in a couple of aspects. So basically all of the salt marsh habitat within that range for the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast population served as a study area, so they were actually able to put out these cameras with the full extent of their survey area. But basically they use, it's a very interesting setup. It's a floating camera trap. So they take a 7-gallon bucket, they attach a camera to the very top of it, and then they invert that on top of a floating platform. And then they float this out into these saltwater habitats. They tried different lures. They found that the type of lure didn't affect. They had seed in some of them, actual scent lures in others, and found that there was no effect really of the lure that they used. But it was pretty surprising in both of the populations. Mink readily took to using these buckets, probably as refugia. If you think about a salt marsh habitat, there's probably not a lot of cover, so they would go into these buckets and lays around, use it for cover, whatever. So I think that's my favorite picture that they sent in the study. So they kept these floating cameras out for no less than 14 days, and they would move it to a new location. And then kind of some of the preliminary results from those, they found that the latency to the first detection was about a week. So they waited about a week before they got their first, for the cameras that did detect mink. About 7 days before the mink would show up, and then a range of different, for both different populations. The time of detection, I believe, for neither one of these populations was the timing significant in differences between it, but they did find that the Atlantic coast subpopulation tended to be more nocturnal, with strong peaks around crepuscular hours, dawn and dusk. And then the Gulf Coast populations used the buckets at all hours of the day, but 50% of those detections were between 7 and 11 a.m. So one thing that we look at for our population trying to perform these surveys, we kind of see that we need to leave the traps out there for at least a week before we can expect to see mink. And then time of day really kind of up in the air at this point. So the results from other results that were pretty interesting, the Atlantic coast population, they found that as the water became fresher, the mink detections decreased. So the more saline environments, actually there were more mink occurring there. Mink were more likely to be detected further from land. I thought that was very interesting. And mink were more likely to be detected in smaller creeks as opposed to the bigger, wider open flowways. Also, vegetation data was not a reliable indicator of mink presence. That's again for the Atlantic coast subpopulation. The Gulf Coast, not as many lessons learned, but tide strength in their prediction models was the most important variable that they found predicting mink detectability. And so that kind of gets me to the project here locally that I'm working on. Here we have a map of the potential habitat that's been described as potential for Everglades mink. Currently, to date, most of our work has been in the Fakahatchee Strand State Park, I think exclusive to Fakahatchee Strand. So a lot of area out there that we're not currently surveying, and especially since we're getting these detections from Everglades National Park. And for those So Fakahatchee Strand up in this area. So we've actually surveyed a very small proportion of what we could potentially find. So study objectives, again, very similar to the other two populations. We're looking to systematically survey these areas, all different habitat types and all different times of the year, and eventually hope to evaluate the taxonomy of Everglades mink by collecting DNA samples. Again, this can be done with roadkills that are collected through Fakahatchee or the entire area. So most likely we'll not be trapping study design, very similar to the other populations. One thing that they, kind of a lesson learned previous to my starting on the project, these floating bucket traps are not as successful in the cypress areas as they were up north. I think that probably again speaks to the fact that the mink were using them as refugia. So out in Waxahachie, they have tree stumps, other areas that they can hide, so the buckets are not as attractive to the mink to use as potentially other areas. Or I'm just selecting really bad because. So we do have basically camera traps that we put out. I run them for a month at a time. I do still use the bucket traps just to get that, just to have that data to show that they are effective or not effective. Mostly though, I just attach the cameras to tree areas where I think that the mink would potentially use. So especially look for runways, logs that are down over wet areas, deadfall that I can use that I think a mink might actually be able to use that. Typically, this dry time of year, I would expect to have more ephemeral puddles where I could hope that the prey would be concentrated, put some cameras up around those, but I've found to date that it's been very wet, still getting wetter, so those puddles are not working out for me too great right now. So the study results, the biologist that was working on this project previous to me started putting out cameras in August of 2014. He ran 313 cameras through June of 2015. I came on in November, and I've since placed 45 cameras. I've been running them for a little bit longer, I think, than he has, about 30 days at a time. So far collected 21,600 plus camera hours, and in all of my time and his time here, I still have not captured a mink on camera. He was able to get 2 on camera, so it's still remaining a very elusive species. So that's what we're working with so far. So future directions. In addition to hopefully getting more pictures of mink, we are going to expand the monitored areas. Like I said, to date, all of our cameras have been placed in the Waxahachie Strand. We're starting to work with, hopefully in the next couple of months, moving those cameras out into Peking Strand State Forest, some of those other conservation areas along US 41 where they've got that salt marsh, fresh marsh, and cypress kind of interface. We're also going to start incorporating visual transect surveys into the data collection. Anybody that's worked with or volunteered with Mike Owen out in Waxahachie, he does basically a wildlife blitz, which is very similar to what we're hoping to start doing more often. He just goes out and has volunteers lining Jane Scenic Drive out to the Waxahachie, collects data for 2 hours, everything that's sighted. So hopefully this would supplement our mink sighting reports if people are seeing them more frequently. Also, still doing taxonomy mostly on roadkills and specimens that are brought in as they're captured. So that's pretty much all I have. I can entertain some questions. I would just like to acknowledge the help of a lot of people putting this together. I borrowed a lot of pictures. Had some help in the field from Jay Staton, who is here today. And actually, he has some video footage, so if we have enough time, I have about a minute of mink footage that would be pretty interesting to see. And with that, if you do have mink sightings that you suspected or confirmed, you can go to this website. It's pretty easy to find. You can just go to myfwc.com and type in, search for it. So yeah, you can just put in your mink sighting. It helps us just gather more data and know where sightings are occurring.
We do have time for questions.
Could you expand on those visual transect surveys that you might expand into?
Pretty much at this point, the protocol for that hasn't been handed down to me, but it's basically, it'll just be going to suspected habitats and just spending X amount of hours and covering X distance, see what we see and when we see it. It'll probably be different times of the day, different habitat types.
Okay.
Is that sufficient for you?
That's about as much as they have online too.
Yes.
Maybe you said this, I apologize if you did. But, because there's so much cover in the Waxahachie, did you adjust any of the platform and bucket, like camouflage it or make it look like a stump, or have you tried anything like that alternatively?
No. I believe that they did try initially when they were setting them up in salt marsh habitats, they did try clumping grass around them. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that they found there was no difference between just a bucket and something that looked more natural.
Does anything else use the buckets?
Yeah, they actually, this was a modified from a small mammal project, and I think from University of Florida, there was research they were doing small mammal work on it, and they found that it was used pretty readily by many different.
So what are you getting pictures of?
I'm not getting pictures of anything. I had a mouse go in, I couldn't identify which species, but they were getting many different things.
Do you want us while we're out there to stick our head in the bucket and wait?
Really something to look at.
That'd be something.
Have you used lures on your non-bucket camera traps?
I do use lures. I use lures at all the cameras, and it's so far been pretty much ineffective. They are commercially available mink lures that trappers use, but nothing so far has really. Bobcats love them. The lures, but no mink yet.
Thank you, Amy. I think if I was voting, I would choose the most charismatic one. Yeah, let's find
Well, I drive, so when I hear them, I get out. They're usually like, you can usually walk up to them.
Have you seen more than one? You've seen a family.
You can hear them listening.
No, this is Yeah, so this is just kind of what I was looking for if I was out there. I would look for a fallen tree or something that I'd expect them to use to cross different bodies of water. So kind of watch the lower left corner here.